is Lois Reyes. Lois is Service Manager at Derbyshire County Council's Welfare Rights Service and the Derbyshire Discretionary Fund.
Thank you, Paul. So, as Paul said, I'm Service Manager for the Welfare Rights Service for Derbyshire County Council and the Discretionary Fund, and therefore sort of positioned in the advice world and dealing with people who can't necessarily navigate their way through the benefits system without support. And before we say any more about that, I recognise that some of you might know something called the Pareto principle, which is about the 80-20 split. And we spend quite a lot of our time working with the 20, the percentage of people who can't manage without some support. It might be that they just need advice and information, and then they can manage the situation they're in themselves. Or it could be that we need to support them who need more than information to navigate their way successfully through the requirements and expectations of the benefit system. So what I'm going to share with you now is some thoughts that we have around some of the issues that we expect people might have, some of the concerns we've got about the difficulties that people might experience. And those are gleaned from national discussions that are going on across the sector, listening to those who are further ahead than us on the journey, so areas that have been using universal credit longer than we have, and from our own local experience, as we now have several areas that are beginning to work with universal credit. So some of our first concerns cluster around access. As Tina's already mentioned, barring exceptional circumstances, universal credit claims must be made online. The latest data from the Office of National Statistics indicates that although 84% of households report having internet access, less than 50% say they've ever used the internet to access information or to download or complete forms of any kind. Of the households without internet access, lack of skills was given as the reason 32% of the time, and costs was given 12% of the time. An additional relevant factor for claiming online was that 41% of those respondents in the survey said they had problems with speed to save or access data, and that's going to become quite important when they're filling a form in online. So a lot of people will either have no personal access to a computer, or they may not have the skills needed to complete the online form. A particular concern at the moment is that the universal credit form must be completed in one session, and our understanding is that that takes around 45 minutes if you're fairly competent in using the situation. Unlike other online forms, it's not yet possible to save what you have done and come back to it later. So you need to have all the information that you need for that form in one go and do it all in one lot. So one of our themes today will be discussing how we can establish sufficient support for people in this situation. We need to explore what support is available and from whom to help people make a correct and timely claim. Universal credit was intended to be IT-based throughout the lifetime of a claim, including reporting changes of circumstances and receiving information decisions from the DWP. This has yet to come. It's not in place yet. But we will need to know if and when that's going to be pursued and how it will be managed given the lack of access that some people have. We also need to recognise that there's an access to job centres issue owing to the rural nature of a lot of Derbyshire, not necessarily where we are today, but claimants' access to job centres can be, for some of our communities, a concern. Claimants may be required to sign on frequently and attend other meetings, and we have historical problems relating to access to transport links, lack of available money for travel, and the sheer distances involved, which need to be factored in. There is at present a facility for signing on by post, but it's not well used. It will be interesting to know if Universal Credit will offer such a facility and if it will be publicised and used. So those are some concerns around access that we can explore as we're going through today. We've also got a difference in terms of how claims will be paid that you may have heard already in what Tina was saying. Payments will be made monthly and in arrears, and people will need help and support to adjust to a new way of payments, and this will create the need for budgeting advice and also potentially an increased workload for the Derbyshire Discretionary Fund if people don't have enough money before their next universal credit payment. There will usually only be one payment. For instance, money for children will no longer necessarily go to their main carer. This has implications for families affected by problems such as domestic violence or other abuse, and the victims may not readily realise about having an independent income. The government is offering alternative arrangements where there are problems, but we need to understand those more and make sure that information is widely available and that we can signpost people to those where it's appropriate. Rent payments also will be included as part of universal credit and not as a separate benefit. and will not, as a rule, be paid direct to landlords, either social or private. Some people may struggle to budget. Others who are in debt may be under severe financial pressure to pay creditors before their rent. Alternative payments arrangements, as Tina's mentioned, are possible, but again, we all need to understand more about those and know what can be available and how people can find out. Claimants may have to wait up to 5 weeks for their first payment of universal credit. And from the 3rd of August this year, there will also be a 7-day waiting period for most universal credit claims. This would appear to mean that claimants will have to wait up to 6 weeks to be paid. Short-term benefit advances will be available where there is a delay in making a payment on a claim, and these will need to be better publicised, as claimants seem, from our experience, very unaware of them. In fact, the only information we can find that is made available to claimants is that reference there. You might not be able to see it on the slide, which is in the welcome pack. We also need to know that short-term benefit advances for universal credit are repayable. Some claimants will be without money during all or some of the 6-week period, once again creating problems for the Derbyshire Discretionary Fund and food banks, all of whom have limited support available that they can give to any one individual or family. At the moment, universal credit affects single unemployed people who meet the gateway conditions and who make new claims in 6 job centres in Derbyshire. This will expand and become more complicated. One of our welfare benefits officers has a bent for artistic impression, and we tried to capture some of that. So that's copyright artwork to the Welfare Rights Service. I haven't quite paid him yet, but never mind. So the new circumstances of universal credit claims will change. For example, somebody might get a job, they might meet a new partner, the partner may have children, they may become unable to work due to illness or disability, they may become a carer, but they'll stay on universal credit. We might hear reference today later on to a lobster pot. Once you're in universal credit, you're in universal credit. Apparently once you're in a lobster pot, you can't get out. Although we have picked up on the discussion recently that there may be some options for claimants about whether they actually do need to stay on universal credit or go onto your employment support allowance or other benefits. So that's something that we're not sure about as an advice organisation, and certainly it's something that needs to be very clear for claimants if they're facing those changes of circumstances. So universal credit will be introduced to more Derbyshire job centres, again initially for single claimants later this year, and change of circumstances for these new claimants will then again expand and complicate the universal credit cases that job centres, advisors and claimants must deal with. While this is happening, other claimants remain in receipt of existing benefits, and so for some considerable time there will be 2 benefit systems in place, and this may cause confusion. We need to be clear on what those benefits are and who's in the different situations. In future, but not yet, existing claimants will move to universal credit, and people in work will get universal credit instead of working tax credit, and they will potentially be subjected to benefit sanctions even when working, and that's further down the line, we know that. This will create, you expect me to say this, but this will create an increased need for advice and clear, regularly updated, reliable information for Derbyshire people, and an even greater need for advice agencies to work jointly with the Department for Work and Pensions. One of our other concerns is that some people may be worse off in universal credit. In the immediate term, we need to look at the universal credit sanctions regime to see if it will have as heavy an impact on food banks and the discretionary fund as the current JSA sanctions regime has. In the longer term, we'll need to consider the effects upon families of in-work sanctions. Also in the longer term, as universal credit becomes more widely available, we need to consider situations in which people may be worse off than under the current system. It's important to note before I give you some brief comparisons, that there will be transitional protection for claimants transferring to universal credit from the so-called legacy benefits. But some of the groups that we can foresee may in the future receive less from the benefit system than equivalent people currently do are pensioners who live with someone of working age. At the moment, if one of a couple becomes a pensioner, both of the couple can claim pension credit. Under the universal credit system, you both have to be of pension age before you can access pension credit. And if you haven't realised up to now, pensioner benefits are generally better financially than working age benefits. So that's one group that we've got concerns around. We've also got concerns around benefits for disabled people and carers who cannot go to work. Universal credit is at its best when it makes work pay for single unemployed people. But in our view, it has an inherent flaw where a situation arises where a person cannot work at all owing to severe disability. And within this, we have to remember that some people are both disabled and a carer. Some severely disabled couples are carers for one another. The current benefit system enables additional payments, which are called premiums, to people with disabilities and to carers, and responds to situations in which severely disabled people are also carers. Universal credit pays much less in those situations. The only way in which someone could be better off is through working, and for these claimants, that's not possible. Comparisons of weekly income under the current system and for universal credit for disabled people reveal that some could be significantly worse off. For example, a single person living alone, unable to work at all due to disability, would currently get approximately £186 a week under the Employment Support and Allowance regime. Under universal credit, that would be £146, which is £40 a week less. A couple, both of whom are too severely disabled to work and are caring for one another, would currently get a maximum of £366 under the current system. Under universal credit, that would be £222, which is £143 a week less. We're at the early stages of this journey in Derbyshire. Those at the gateway are currently relatively few in number. In the universal credit pathfinder areas, which started before us in other parts of the country, the numbers of those in the claimant count, i.e. registered as actively seeking employment and who are on universal credit, is approaching 50%. Now, I don't know if you can see the detail of that slide. There's a column on the left-hand side which says job seekers allowance. There's a column in the middle which says universal credit. Those are the numbers of claimants, and the column on the right-hand side is the total claimant count. So for areas like Bolton, Bury, Manchester, Oldham, Rochdale, Salford, Stockport, Tameside, Trafford, those are the figures for how many people they've got on their claimant count at the moment, and about half of them are on universal credit, and the other half are still on job seekers allowance. So those areas that have been there a long time before us, they've still got universal credit for some, job seekers allowance for some. Okay? And Carmel will have a look with you in a few minutes about what it's looking like in Derbyshire now.